Well, hello everyone, and welcome to another one of my continuing professional development lectures. This one is entitled Crisis and Emergency Communications, a primer for public health and other practitioners. And my name is Professor Brian Mangum, and many of you know me already because you've been watching some of my other CPD activities. But for those who do not know me, I'll give you a quick introduction. I'm a consultant epidemiologist, and I'm also an assistant professor of epidemiology and biostatistics within the School of Public Health and Primary Care at Fiji National University, the former Fiji School of Medicine. And I'm also an assistant professor of epidemiology and public health in the public health training program at the College of Micronesia, Federated States of Micronesia, which is where I'm currently located for the next 3 years under a grant between the University of Arizona and the Pacific Island Health Officers Association to bring continuous professional development activities like this to the region. One of the other reasons that we're going to be talking about crisis and emergency communications today is that I also fill a role at the Fiji National University of being the program coordinator for postgraduate disaster risk management. Okay, and that's located once again within the School of Public Health and Primary Care. It's an entirely online program, and I'll actually talk a little bit more about that towards the end of the lecture today. But one of the things that we teach in the postgrad DRM program is we teach from a public health standpoint things like crisis and emergency communications. In other words, how do you communicate before, during, and after an emergency towards specific targeted audiences? How do you convey a message without conveying fear such that you can get the general population to take the actions that you want them to take? The other reason that we're going to be talking about this today is many of you know, so if you're listening to this, it's February 2016, and many of you know that Fiji was just struck by a tropical cyclone Winston over the weekend, and if it had happened here in the northern hemisphere, we would have called it a super typhoon. It's actually the strongest cyclone on recorded history to ever strike in the southern hemisphere. And most of our cyclones in the southern hemisphere in Fiji come at us from the west, from the other side of the country. But this one kind of swooped back around the country after we thought it had passed us, and it actually came in through Suva, which is the main capital city where all the embassies and government offices are located, and cut a swath right across Suva and cut a swath right across a very populated area of the main island as well as the second largest island, Vanuatu. And as of this going to press, so to speak, there have been 21 deaths, countless devastation. So as you know, natural disasters, crises like this, they're nothing new to the Pacific. Really, it's a matter of not if a crisis will come, but when a crisis will come. And so for our medical and our nursing and our public health practitioners that we're speaking to out there, it's important that you be able to have the skills you need to effectively communicate with audiences during a crisis. And so that's one of the main reasons that I put this lecture together. It's very timely, and it's also very appropriate for the Pacific as well. So let's jump right in. Okay, let's do a quick little overview of what we're going to talk about today. So the first question, why this lecture? Well, I've really already answered that for you. Like I said, you need to be able to effectively communicate messages both before, during, and after a crisis. And we need to make sure that those messages are communicated in a way that conveys the need for action but avoids prompting fear in the target population. So what we'll actually talk about today is we're going to talk a little bit about the psychology of crisis. We're going to talk about the different steps, the different psychological reactions that people have, both before, during, and after a crisis. And then what we're going to do is we're going to use that to come up with a list of basically 7 recommendations that you can use that are based in the psychology of trauma that you can use to convey appropriate messages that don't frighten the audience but yet prompt them into taking action. Okay, and one of the reasons that we need to do this is because the public can actually become very confused and they can panic if they don't have accurate information on risks and in particular what they need to do. Now keep in mind, panic is actually relatively rare during a disaster, but if we're not effectively communicating with people, if they don't feel like they're getting an accurate assessment of what the true risks are and the dangers are from government and other organizations, then they tend to panic. So long as we're honest with people and we convey an accurate message, panic is relatively rare, okay? But people need to trust us, and that trust comes from receiving accurate pictures of the situation from leadership, okay? What is this not? Well, this is not a lecture on technical communications, all right? This isn't how to set up radio relay networks or satellite communications or anything like that, okay? The other message we're going to try to convey in this lecture is we're going to talk about mass communications. Now, when I say mass communications, I'm talking about radio, television, internet, Facebook, newspapers, and so on and so forth, okay? All forms of communication that are readily used here in the Pacific, okay? Now, these sources of mass communication can be both your friend and your enemy. They can be your friend because they allow you to convey certain messages to the general public in an appropriate manner, but they also can be your enemy in terms of promoting fear and panic in the population if the media outlets that we're using to communicate our message to the public don't receive the appropriate messages from us to convey to the public. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that in the coming slides. And like I mentioned, we already mentioned that we're going to talk about the psychology of crisis. And essentially, we're going to go through 5 different psychological reactions that the populations you serve might have in response to a looming crisis. Okay. Then we'll make some recommendations for communication. So we'll talk about the 7 factors that you need to keep in mind when drafting communication messages during a crisis or an emergency. And then we'll finalize the lecture by giving you access to some resources to help you with emergency communications. We'll talk about getting you access to the Manual of Crisis and Communications from the US CDC, and then I'll also mention some of the resources that we have at Fiji National University. We actually, within the School of Public Health and Primary Care, we have a discipline of emergency public health, okay, or emergency public health management that deals with a lot of aspects like this, and that includes both a bachelor's of public health in emergency public health management, which is largely online, and then that postgraduate certificate in disaster risk management, which is from a public health standpoint that is entirely online. So both excellent programs that you can get access to here in the Pacific. So like I mentioned already, the media can be both your friend and it can be your enemy, all right, in terms of communicating certain messages to the populations that we serve. So if you just take a look at some of the headlines that we have here dealing with fear and emergency communications, you can see the one from the Daily Express on the left there. That's a paper out of the UK. Swine flu will kill 350 people per day. Okay, so here we have this warning from experts about H1N1 splayed right across the front page of a major newspaper in the UK, stating that if swine flu comes to the UK, 350 people a day are going to die. All right, or you've got the one off to the right there, common bug that can turn into a killer. So you can see what's happening here is that media, all right, in certain instances, isn't promoting a reasoned response from individuals. They aren't promoting these are the facts. This is what you can do to protect yourself and your family. These are the actions you can take. What they're doing is they're promoting a state of fear. Okay, and you can see one kind of in the background of everything that deals with Zika virus, one of the things that's currently a hot public health issue. Oh, and by the way, if you will go to my YouTube page, I have a short CPD, Continuous Professional Development Activity, that deals with Zika virus and public health in the Pacific, what you need to know. So please go out and search that out and you can watch that. But anyway, Zika virus is a current issue here, worldwide in the Pacific and so on and so forth. And so there's this wonderful article that appeared on NPR, National Public Radio, that dealt with when fear becomes an unintended public health problem. So sometimes, even though we're trying to promote action on the part of the public in terms of steps that they can take to protect themselves, their families, and their communities, and action is a healthy thing. When we give people something to do, they actually feel empowered. Okay, and a lot of times the fear and the apprehension of a looming public health or natural disaster threat is lessened when we give people something to do. But when we simply provide them with frightening messages like swine flu will kill 350 people every day, people become overwhelmed with that fear. They don't know what actions to take, and it can actually lead to states of denial as well as avoidance, and people don't take the steps that they need to take. Okay, and I love this one in the lower right-hand corner because what this is this deals with this concept of putting things in perspective. So you've got the individual that he's looking at the newspaper there about ISIS, the Islamic Republic, okay, or the Islamic State, excuse me, and the threat from terrorism, and he's terrified of that, all right? But who does he have looming behind him? He's got the Zika virus looming behind him, all right? So one of the things that we're actually going to talk about today is this concept of being careful with risk comparisons, all right? So if you think about terrorism, For most of us living out here in the Pacific, in our little paradise islands of whether it's Chuuk or Pohnpei or CNMI or Guam or American Samoa, the threat of terrorism is actually a very low possibility. It's a low threat, okay? But so it's low risk. We're probably not going to be the target of Al Qaeda or ISIS out here. But even though it's low risk, it's high anxiety provoking, all right? Because we think about terrorism, we think about anthrax, or we think about dirty bombs, or we think about kidnappings or explosions and things like that. And it's terrifying to us, and it promotes a certain level of anxiety for ourselves, our homes, our families, our communities, our friends, our colleagues, okay? And so we have the threat of that. But it's a very low risk threat, whereas we have the threat of Zika, which is a very likely threat here in the Pacific. It was in French Polynesia as recently as 2012. It was out here in Chuuk, I believe, as recently as a couple of years ago as well. Okay. And so we kind of balance this thing between high risk, all right, things that are likely to happen to us, and high anxiety, or things that are less likely to happen to us but are still anxiety provoking. And what we need to do in public health and medicine with our communications messages is we've got to find a way to find the middle ground, so that we can get people to a level of actually wanting to take action to protect their communities, but at a level where their anxiety is not elevated such that they refuse to take action. So in other words, they feel paralyzed. They're unable to take action because they're too afraid of the potential of an incident. Okay, so we'll get a little bit more into that as we go along. So like I mentioned earlier in the slides, it's important to remember, and you know this because you live out here in the Pacific, is that in the Pacific, disasters happen. It's not a matter of if a disaster is going to happen, it's a matter of when will the disaster happen. And it's usually natural disasters that we're dealing with, such as cyclones and landslides and tsunamis and floods and things like that, okay? But there is other types of disasters that we deal with. We deal with public health disasters such as infectious disease outbreaks like Zika or typhoid or cholera or something like that. And then we actually do have the potential for certain man-made disasters out here as well. You know, we occasionally host large meetings or large events like the Micronesian Games or the Pan-Pacific Games and things like that. And those, in theory, could also be targets for terrorism events as well. Okay, so disasters are something that we live with out here. Now, when it comes to effective communications and disaster risk communications, I want you to keep in mind that these act as what we call a resource multiplier. In other words, they take us in our public health bubble or our medical bubble, and they allow us to go beyond the capacities that we have to communicate with the general public one-on-one, and we use things like radio, newspaper, television, the internet, and so on and so forth to communicate to larger audiences. So the mass media becomes a resource multiplier for us during a crisis, a disaster, or for an emergency. So for example, during a crisis, you may find yourself overwhelmed with requests from information. Now, who do those requests from information come from? They usually come from the media, and they come from the public, and they come from other government agencies. And when it comes to managing this information, a lot of times conflicting messages tend to be sent out by the different agencies, all right? So when it comes to using the mass media, we need to remember that use of effective communication techniques are going to allow us to avoid resource overutilization or the misuse by managing and eliminating many of the issues that might come up. Okay, so in other words, without effective communications, then we get negative individual and community reactions to disasters. And that's what we're trying to avoid. We want to make sure that the communities that we serve get appropriate messages so that they can take appropriate actions. And one of the things I mentioned already, and we'll go over this again here in a minute, is the fact that when the public feels like they're not getting information, or when they feel like they're not getting accurate information, that's when we tend to see panic happening. All right. Now, when we look back over the history of disasters, we tend to see that when the public is effectively communicated with, they don't overreact. They tend to be willing to take the appropriate measures. Now, many of the expected negative individual and community behaviors that we might expect from the public during a disaster can actually be mitigated with effective emergency and risk communication. Now, each crisis is going to carry with it its own, what we might call, psychological baggage. Now, the public health practitioner needs to anticipate the mental stress that the population is going to be experiencing, and when they can anticipate that, they can apply appropriate risk communication strategies to attempt to manage this stress in the population. Okay. Now, I want to point out that risk communication is a fully legitimate tool of the disaster risk management community, and it's a tool that we want to use in terms of preparation, response, and recovery activities, just like we would use any other resource that we would apply in a disaster. Okay, so it's important that we integrate this in to our public health emergency management protocols. I also want to mention that disaster communications, okay, is not an attempt at mass mental health therapy, all right, okay? Rather, what it is it's a reasoned, it's a mature communications approach to allow us to select the appropriate message, the appropriate messenger, such as the newspaper, the radio, the internet, whatever it happens to be, and then get that message to the appropriate audience to lessen the psychological impact of the disaster on that audience. Okay, so what we're going to do in the next section is we're going to look at the different ways that people tend to react to a disaster, and then as we go along, we'll apply that to developing appropriate disaster communication messages. Now, as I've mentioned already, it's important for the public health disaster communications individual to understand that in a crisis, people often manifest some type of psychological reaction to the crisis, to the things that are going on around them. And we can break these down into 5 different areas that we'll talk about. And these are going to be vicarious rehearsal, denial, stigmatization, fear and avoidance, and then the final one we'll talk about is going to be withdrawal, hopelessness, and helplessness. So let's start out with this concept of vicarious rehearsal. Now it's interesting to note, all right, that people, the further the individual is away, okay, from the actual threat, from the actual disaster, all right, the more radical their response tends to be to the actual crisis. Okay, now what I mean to say by that is, we live in the information age now. Okay, and communication in the information age allows us to essentially participate in disasters on the other side of the globe as they unfold vicariously by watching TV, by reading newspapers, by going online, reading blogs, looking at pictures, videos on YouTube, and so on and so forth. Okay, and what we see a lot of times is that individuals on the other side of the globe might actually feel as if they are participating directly in the actual disaster as it unfolds, even though they're not physically there and there's no danger of actually having that individual impacted by the disaster itself. So what happens is essentially we get what we call armchair victims, and these armchair victims watch as a disaster unfolds, okay, and they tend to essentially judge the course of actions on the part of individuals in the actual place where the disaster is happening. And so what they do is they watch the course of actions that governments and disaster response agencies are taking, and in some instances, these people actually may reject the proposed course of action. They might look at it and say to themselves, well, if I was there, I certainly could have reacted in a different manner than what I see happening in the newspaper. Okay? And so what you get is these individuals, they start to immerse themselves in the disaster even though they're not physically present or threatened by it. And so they start to ask themselves questions like, well, what would I do if my water was contaminated? What if I needed to be vaccinated? What if my community was under threat from cholera or Zika or something? What if there was a tsunami here and my loved ones were killed? What if that landslide happened here and my home was washed away? Okay, and so what happens then is these individuals essentially become what we call the worried well. All right, they're under no threat. They're under no physical threat, they're under no emotional threat from the disaster, but they actually develop a mental picture of themselves as being present in the disaster. These individuals then present into the local healthcare system, such as mental health clinics, primary care clinics, and sometimes they have the ability to overwhelm local resources. Okay, so I have an example to illustrate this. About a year or so ago, in one of the larger Pacific jurisdictions, there was a mass media campaign run that said a sore throat can kill you. All right. Now, what they were looking at was they were looking at strep A as it relates to rheumatic heart disease, and they wanted people to actually start having, if you had a child exhibiting the symptoms of a strep A or a strep throat, they wanted you to make sure that you got the child in and treated so that we could avoid rheumatic heart disease, which is already a problem, a burden of disease here in the Pacific. Well, the problem was this had a very big backlash in terms of vicarious rehearsal. So suddenly, individuals that did not meet the criteria for a strep throat, they maybe had just a simple sore throat. Maybe it was simply caused by a cold, the sinus drainage back of the sore throat. Okay, but they had seen these mass media campaigns that said a sore throat can kill you. And so, in this particular Pacific Island jurisdiction, the local clinics and the public health clinics and the emergency departments were overwhelmed by individuals going through this vicarious rehearsal where they felt that they were under threat of dying from a sore throat that really wasn't strep A. Okay. Another example from this is I can remember an example from the 1980s in New York City, and there was a mass media campaign run about Kawasaki's disease, which can be a very serious disease, particularly in children. Okay, but the way the media campaign ran, it presented it such that it seemed like anybody that had flu-like symptoms, particularly any child that had flu-like symptoms, had Kawasaki's disease, and the public health department was overwhelmed with phone calls, emergency departments were overwhelmed with children, local practitioners were overwhelmed with kids. Okay, so we need to make sure that in terms of this vicarious rehearsal, that we're ensuring that individuals far away from the disaster, or now once again, it doesn't have to be far away from the disaster. It can just be people who are located within the same area but not directly impacted by it. We need to make sure that they get the appropriate message so that they don't overwhelm local healthcare resources. Okay, so that was a vicarious rehearsal. Now let's talk briefly about denial. Now, members of the community will experience denial, okay? And so when we have denial, what we do is we have the following types of symptoms in these individuals, okay? Individuals experiencing denial avoid getting the warnings or action recommendations, so they avoid media, they don't read the newspaper, they don't listen to the radio. They may become agitated or confused by the warnings, okay? They may not believe that the threat is real, and when they don't believe the threat is real, they tend not to take action. Or they might not believe the threat is real to them. So in other words, they believe a cyclone is coming, but they don't believe that it will be a threat to their community. Okay, we actually saw this over this last weekend with Tropical Cyclone Winston in Fiji. Traditionally, cyclones, as I mentioned before, hit Fiji from the west, from the Nandi area. Well, this cyclone came back around and it hit Suva. And one of the common beliefs among the population in the eastern half of Fiji is that Suva is cyclone proof. Cyclones don't hit Suva. So, in other words, in the media storm leading up to the approach of Tropical Cyclone Winston, despite warnings from government, people on the eastern half of Fiji in the Suva area were not as well prepared as they could have been. So in other words, they believed there was a threat, but they didn't believe the threat was real to them because, hey, we live in Suva. Suva doesn't get hit by cyclones. Well, in this instance, Suva was hit by a cyclone. Okay. So what you get is when an individual is experiencing denial, and this is what we would call one of the Freudian defense mechanisms, and it's very common in a range of people, not just individuals in disasters. It's very common in medical patients as well. So when we have an individual experiencing denial, what they do is they don't take the recommended steps to ensure their safety until the absolute last moments, and sometimes when it's even too late. So once again, we saw this in Suva. We saw people packing the grocery stores at the very last minute, trying to get access to food, water, batteries, and so on and so forth. Okay. And a lot of times what we see is with denials, it's born out of this belief that life no longer makes sense. We all go along and we live in this nice happy bubble where we have our family and our jobs and our car and our bills, and maybe we go out to eat on a Friday night with our family, and maybe we get together on Sunday afternoon after church, and so on and so forth. And we're living this nice happy little life, and then bam! Disaster strikes. And how can this be happening to me? Bad things don't happen to me. Well, I'll just deny that it's happening, and I won't take action, and hopefully it'll just go away. Well, obviously that doesn't happen, and with the denial, like I mentioned already, you get individuals refusing to take action, and the end result is that they're not prepared for the disaster. Now, one of the other reactions we can see is stigmatization. Now, sometimes there are individuals in our communities, okay, that are perceived as outsiders. Now, I want you to think about your particular community, the individuals that you serve, and consider whether or not there are certain groups within the population you serve that are considered outsiders and may sometimes actually be refused services by the communities, okay? Are these individuals that are foreigners? Are these individuals that are refugees from other islands? I know that across Micronesia, sometimes there are individuals who have come from other islands to live. Okay? Are these members of different ethnic groups, or are these people that have actually been displaced by a disaster? Okay. The problem is when you have these individuals, sometimes they're perceived as outsiders, and because they're perceived as outsiders in the days leading up to, or sometimes hours leading up to disasters, and then during the disaster and after the disaster, because they are stigmatized, they're considered foreigners to our communities, sometimes they are not given full access to the services that we need. Okay. The other time that we would see this is when we have an infectious disease outbreak, such as following a natural disaster. Okay, and we see that individuals who have a specific disease are stigmatized by the community, and so because they believe they're stigmatized, because they believe they're not welcomed by the community, then they tend not to seek out the services offered by the community, such as medical care and so on and so forth. And we saw this during the Ebola outbreak in Africa last year. We saw that individuals, even if they didn't have Ebola, even if they just had symptoms of Ebola, they were stigmatized. They were became outcasts from their communities. Okay, so that's a common psychological reaction on the part of the public to an impending disaster, is to stigmatize individuals, to turn inward, and to only take care of ourselves, our families, our communities, the people that we go to church with, the people that we associate with, and so on and so forth. So we need to be aware of that in preparing our disaster communication messages. Okay, so we're almost done talking about the psychological responses. So let's talk about fear and avoidance really quick. Now, fear is an important psychological consideration in response to a disaster, okay? Fear is going to come in a variety of different ways. It can be the fear of unknown or the fear of uncertainty, okay? And fear can actually be very debilitating, all right, in terms of its psychological response. In other words, people feel so overwhelmed, okay, by the fear of the actual event that they would rather do nothing than actually face up to the reality that is coming towards them. Okay. So it can result in inaction. The other thing it can result in is really strange and inappropriate behavior. So in other words, this might be the individual that instead of boarding up his house, stands on his roof and curses at the storm. All right. It's all a response to fear. It's all a response to the unknown and feeling that they don't have the ability to take action to meet the crisis. So here's an example. Fear of an impending cyclone and not having enough food or water in the house. All right, that's a common fear that people think, oh, well, you know, essential services are going to get cut off. I'm not going to have enough water. I won't have electricity. I won't have food, and so on and so forth. But then that fear is compounded by what? Well, it's compounded by maybe not having enough extra money in the bank to go out and buy water and buy canned foods and things like that. Okay, and so rather than finding ways to get around that, rather than turning to neighbors for assistance or turning to religious groups for assistance, these individuals are so paralyzed by the fear that they simply don't take any action. Then when the disaster strikes, they don't have the ability to effectively cope with it. Okay. Now, one of the things that we see with fear and avoidance, or one of the ways we see it manifested, is that people will simply step back and they'll say what? They'll say, let government take care of it. Let government handle it. Let's make sure that government carries water into our communities. Let's make sure that government provides relief supplies from the Red Cross or from AusAid or something like that. I don't have the resources to do this, so I will just be paralyzed into inaction and I will wait for government to take care of me. Well, that's a significant issue everywhere, but in particular in rural and isolated places where sometimes it can take between 72 hours and upwards of 7 to 10 days before we can get professional rescuers into these communities to provide resources. So when we prepare our disaster communication messages, we need to keep this idea in mind that the community needs to be given messages that they can overcome the fear, that they can actually take action, and that they can do something to protect their families. And they need to be given the resources that they need to do that. Okay, that's important once again because we have communities that will be very isolated in the days and the weeks after a disaster. Okay, and then the last of the psychological responses we need to talk about is withdrawal, hopelessness, and helplessness. And this also deals with that concept of government is going to take care of us. Okay, so here what we see is unlike denial. Okay, people undergoing a sense of hopelessness and helplessness, they accept that the threat is real, but they feel that the threat is so large and so frightening that they continue to feel helpless. Okay, so the result is that they tend to withdraw into a state of helplessness where they're no longer capable of taking action to prepare their community, to prepare their family. Okay, or then the other half of the coin that we've already talked about already is they may perceive themselves as simply lacking the resources that they need to take action. And so a lot of times what we see this going beyond just individuals. We see this essentially affecting entire communities and entire areas with this collective sense of helplessness. We're too isolated, we're too poor, we're too weak, we're too small of a village for us to take action as a community. Please, government, will you take action for us? And like we've already indicated, a lot of times government isn't going to have the resources in the immediate after effects of a cyclone or a tsunami or whatever it happens to be to get to every village. So we need to have a way in our crisis communications to teach people to overcome this sense of hopelessness and helplessness so that they move to a state of action and preparation. Okay, so now that we know kind of the psychological background for people and how they feel during a crisis, now let's talk about overcoming psychological pitfalls in our communications. Now, I want to mention really quick that these are all drawn from the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention's Crisis Communications Manual. In fact, everything we've discussed thus far actually is drawn from that manual. What we're going to do is at the end of the lecture is I'm going to give you the link to that manual so you can go out and download it yourself, and you can use that to integrate more appropriate crisis communications into your emergency operations procedures. So we have 7 different strategies or that we can use in preparing our crisis communications. So what we'll do now is we'll just go through those one at a time. All right, so the first one we're going to talk about is being careful with risk comparisons. Now, let me just set the stage for you here. Essentially, remember we talked about in the beginning of the lecture how sometimes we like to give people comparisons because we think it's going to calm their nerves. We'll say things like, well, the threat of terrorism isn't really real in the Pacific, but the threat of Zika virus is. The threat of query fever or the threat of dengue is real, all right? But you silly people, you're all getting upset about the threat of ISIS when you really should be upset about the threat of Zika, dengue, leptospirosis, Ross River fever, NCDs, whatever it happens to be. Okay, so essentially what we have here is we have a situation of true versus perceived risk. Okay, and one element of that is that people are going to perceive risk as a form of social injustice. So if we get up and we make a risk comparison and we tell a community, you shouldn't be worried about ABC because DEF is the real threat, and the community looks at that and they go, well, the message I hear is that my community, you don't think my community is at risk when I perceive my community as risk. All right? And that results in a feeling of social injustice, a feeling that government or NGOs are essentially lying to the communities that they serve. Okay? So I just have an example of this, and it oftentimes happens when we have a particular group that's singled out to bear what they feel is an undue risk. So you probably remember during the H1N1 outbreak, this would be what, 2009, 2010? I'm not saying H1N1 went away, but the real big threat that we had was in '09 and 10. And you remember we were busy trying to develop a vaccine. And so there was this quick, rapid upscaling of the development of vaccines, but we still have limited numbers of vaccines at the time. And so what we decided was that we were going to pick specific groups that were at risk, and we were going to target our mass immunization programs to those specific groups. Okay. Now, what happened was that other people felt left out. Why are you targeting children? Why are you targeting people in early adulthood? All right. And in particular, what you found was that older people felt a form of social injustice because they were the ones that felt like they had traditionally been given access to mass immunization programs for seasonal influenza. And so they wanted to know why they weren't then getting access to the H1N1. Well, from a public health standpoint, we were targeting what we felt would be the most at-risk group, or children and young adults, okay, with the limited resources that we had available. But unfortunately, that led to an outrage on the part of the general public because they failed to understand the true risk burden. They only perceived that they appeared to be overly at risk, okay? So we need to be careful when we make any type of a risk comparison that we're very, very clear with the general population that we're trying to serve what we mean, okay, in terms of whether or not there's an actual low hazard versus high outrage type of scenario, okay. Here's just a quick example of how you can use risk comparison appropriately. So you could say that research indicates that a person is 10 times more likely to be killed by brain damage from a falling coconut than to be killed by a shark. Okay, so in this case, the risks are both natural in origin, they're fairly distributed across the general population, and they're outside the control of the individual. So, in other words, although being killed by a shark may cause greater terror or emotion on the part of the population, its comparison to being killed by a coconut helps the individual see that they may be perceiving the risk as greater than it is. Okay. So, in other words, most people have never considered the risk of dying by a coconut, but they may have considered the risk of being attacked by a shark. Okay. So, just be careful if you're making comparisons and if you're singling out specific segments of the population to make comparisons with in terms of their risk, that you don't get into these areas of social injustice and actually start to create outrage on the part of the public. So the second recommendation in terms of our risk communications is do not over reassure the public. Now, we can expect high outrage if an emergency event is catastrophic, dreaded, unfamiliar, is outside of our control, and so on and so forth. Okay, it's not surprising that people get really upset in situations like that. Now, our tendency as human beings when we have a particularly catastrophic event, okay, is that we want to reassure people that things are going to be okay. That's our natural tendency. But I want you to keep in mind that reassurance can actually backfire. Okay? So, for example, when people are very angry, when they feel that there's a form of social injustice going on and they're unduly being put at risk from an event, reassurance can actually increase their outrage because their perception is that you are either not telling them the truth or you're not taking their concerns into account. Okay? And you also need to keep in mind that an over reassured public is counterproductive. That's not our goal as public health communicators, okay? You want people to be concerned. You want them to be vigilant. We even want them to be hyper vigilant, okay, during the stages leading up to and during an actual disaster, okay? Why? Because we want people to take reasonable precautions. We want them to feel some fear, and we want to have them feel the emotions that are justified by the seriousness of the situation so that they will take action. Okay? Now, keep in mind it's a fine line because too much fear, people get so overwhelmed that they go into a state of denial or into a feeling of helplessness. Okay, so it's a fine line here. And then the other thing to keep in mind is that during a crisis, if we've communicated to the public and we've overestimated the danger, we've overestimated the risk, it's actually easier to amend overestimation down than it is to take something that we've said is less serious and amend it up. All right, so it's better to keep the public in more of a vigilant state than to get them into a passive state where they think that everything is going to be okay. So then our third recommendation in developing appropriate risk communications is to use sensitive syntax. In other words, we're going to put the good news into the subordinate clause for all of our English majors out there. Okay, so like I mentioned, if there's reassurance to give, let's go ahead and let's give that reassurance. Okay, because we want the public to have any of the good information that we can give, but at the same time, we want to emphasize the need for appropriate action on the part of the public. Okay. Now, one way to avoid this overemphasizing the good news and getting the public to be passive about continuing to take appropriate actions is what we call the use of the sensitive syntax. Now, sensitive syntax means putting the good news into what we call the subordinate clause, once again for our English majors out there, with the more alarming information in the main clause. So here we have some examples of what I'm talking about. So we could say, even though we have not seen any new cases of Zika virus in several days, the public should still remain alert and take appropriate action. So in other words, we've given them the good news, but we're still emphasizing the need to stay alert and to take appropriate action. Or there's another example there. It says, while there is little likelihood that Ebola will come to the Pacific, we still must be prepared to screen travelers who are potentially at risk. So in other words, like I said, we're just placing the good news subordinate to the need for us to remain vigilant and to continue to take appropriate action in the population. All right, so then our fourth recommendation is to acknowledge uncertainty. Now, acknowledging uncertainty is going to be most effective when the communicator both shows signs of his or her distress and acknowledges that the audience is distressed as well. Okay, so in other words, we're showing empathy towards the audience that we're serving. Okay, and at the same time, we're acknowledging that we do not have all the information. Once again, going back to that earlier concept that we talked about, is that people tend not to panic so long as they feel that they can trust government. So long as they can feel that they can trust NGOs and the hospital and so on and so forth. So if they feel they're getting accurate information from government and other sources through mass communication channels, then they're less likely to panic, okay? But if we try to cover things up, okay, if we pretend that we know everything when in fact we don't know everything, that creates uncertainty on the part of the general population, and that uncertainty tends to create either panic, and when we get panic, we get overreaction or we get underreaction on the part of our target population. So we want to state in our communications, we want to state our level of frustration without knowing what is going on as well. Okay. So I have some examples here. So for example, you could say in response to a reporter asking you a question, or in response to someone in a public conference asking you a question, you could say, I wish I could answer that question, but at this time we don't know the answer. So in other words, it acknowledges that we have uncertainty as well. It communicates honesty to the audience, and it avoids panic and inappropriate action on the part of the public. And then we have a second example there. It says, it must be very frustrating to the community at this time, but we do not know when the water supply will return. So you're communicating honesty and empathy once again to the audience. All right, so recommendation number 5 is going to be give people something to do. You know this, especially the mothers out there listening to me. If you're trapped in the house during bad weather, the kids get bored. Well, if you give them something to do, then their boredom, their level of anxiety tends to go down. So many of you know Fiji is my home generally, but I'm up here in the northern Pacific. So in the lead up to Tropical Cyclone Winston, I keep mispronouncing that, my lovely wife down in the south, who is also from the States, just like I am, but she's also spent her professional career on islands as well. We have 4 children. Well, in the lead up to the cyclone, my kids were thrilled. All right, they weren't frightened. Well, mostly because they're island kids and they spent their lives on islands. And this is about the 6th cyclone that they've lived through between the Pacific and the Caribbean and so on. But it was because my wife gave them something to do. She put the youngest one to work stacking the cans of tuna in the cupboard. She had the oldest 2 out in the yard helping her put up the hurricane shutters. She had my middle daughter writing down the numbers for all the phone contacts we needed in case there was a loss of communications, or the cell phones. And we all love our cell phones, but we keep all of our numbers in our cell phones. What happens if the cell phone dies? We don't have those numbers. So she put Sophie to work hand copying out those numbers so that she would have access to them. Okay, action overcomes fear, denial, and ambivalence. When we tell people what actions to take, then they are most likely going to take those actions, and that is going to allow them to feel engaged, feel like they're doing something to protect themselves, their homes, and their communities. Okay, and in essence, we're giving them back a sense of control. a sense of control in the crisis. And you can remember one of the problems, one of the psychological issues we have with the crisis is that people feel they've lost control. How can this be happening to me? I don't have the resources I need to take action. This is awful. I'm just going to sit in the corner and wait for the storm. Okay, we want to avoid that. Giving people things to do that are reasonable is one way to overcome that. And one of the things that we're going to do with the populations is we're going to give them a choice of the actions. Everybody loves choices. What do you want for dessert? Do you want the cheesecake? Do you want the brownie? Or do you want the bowl of ice cream? Who doesn't want choices? Well, it's the same thing during a crisis. People want choices, okay? So one type of choice might deal with drinking water following a crisis. Because sometimes following landslides and floods, our drinking water can be contaminated. Okay, and so what sometimes you will do is you will give people three different choices, and we call them the you must, you should, and you can. And what you can see is that they ramp up the level of response. All right, so let's return. Let's say there's a potential cholera outbreak following flooding in a rural area. So we could tell the public the you must statement would be something like, at the minimum, we recommend you boil your water before you cook with it or drink with it. Okay, then the you must statement ramps up the response one level, and it says, now if you believe your water is contaminated, then you can also add bleach to your water. And then we would give them directions on how to add bleach or chlorine to their water. And then the final, the highest level of response, because remember, we're giving people options, because some people will only want to do the minimum, some people will want to do the medium, and some people will want to do the absolute biggest thing that they can do to protect their homes and their communities. And so we have the you can response. And the you can response here would be, is if you're really concerned, then purchase bottled water. Now, notice that this gives people three options, and one thing that you want to bring out of this is that it gives them options based around their ability to react. So if you're living in a rural area where you don't have access to a store, where you can buy bottled water, well, we've given you other options. You can at least boil the water, or if you have access to bleach, here's how to add a few drops of bleach to sterilize your water. Or if you simply don't have money to go out and buy bottled water, same thing again. We've given you two other options, all right? So once again, it gives people something to do, and it gives them a number of choices in terms of what they can do. Now, we can also break down the options we give people for them to take charge and to take action and overcome anxiety. We have three different types of behaviors that we can ask people to engage in. And these are going to be our symbolic behaviors, our preparatory behaviors, and our contingent behaviors. Now, symbolic behaviors are things that we give people simply to keep them busy. I know that sounds bad, but once again, think about kids. If you give kids something to do, they stay busy, they stay out of each other's hair, they don't get into trouble. Okay, and they feel good, they feel happy. It's the same thing with the general public. Sometimes there is nothing they can do, but if we give them something, they feel better. So let's say that, think about the example. So remember last year in the United States, we had that horrible church shooting in South Carolina where the man came into the church and he shot people during a Bible study. Absolutely awful. There was nothing that could be done about that, all right? But people still wanted to take action. So what did they do? They held candlelight vigils outside the church. They laid flowers. They said prayers, okay? It did not change the fact that people were dead. It didn't change the fact that gun violence was real, but people felt better because they took symbolic action. All right? So symbolic action is not a bad thing in allowing people to feel as if they're taking charge of a situation. Now, the other thing that we can do is we can ask people to engage in preparatory behavior. Now, these are things to do now that will minimize your risk if bad things happen later. So this would be like our encouragement to people to have a disaster plan, to store water and canned foods, to create an emergency phone contact list like my daughter was put to work doing, okay? Talking to children about what to do if there's an emergency and they're trapped at school. Listen to your teachers, listen to your headmaster, things like that, okay? Knowing where the evacuation centers are in your community, okay? Our oldest, our 14-year-old, I've taught him how to turn off all the gas at our house. I've taught him how to turn off the power breakers at our house, all right? And so these are preparatory things that people can do that they can learn and they can prepare for, and then later if a disaster strikes, it minimizes the impact of the disaster. And then the final thing that we can ask people to do are what we call contingent behaviors, things that you do if the disaster strikes, okay? So this would be things like tune to your local radio station to listen to announcements from government. Evacuate to the nearest emergency center if you were told to do so by police or fire authorities. Okay, boiling water if you're told how to do if you're told to do so. Immunizing your child if there's a vaccine available to a specific threat, and so on and so forth. Okay, all of these give people something to do. They feel useful. They take charge, and these are things that we can communicate to them in our emergency communications protocols. We're getting close. We're on step number 6, or recommendation number 6, for inclusion in your emergency communication messages. And step number 6 is stop trying to allay the panic. All right. So, like I've mentioned a couple of times, panic is much less common than we imagine. If we look at the literature on disaster communications, we see that it's replete with unfulfilled expectations that the public is going to panic, they're going to riot, they're going to storm the citadel, things like that. And in actuality, people nearly always behave extremely well in a crisis. And I really must compliment the Pacific on this. I've worked in emergency management as well as public health in quite a few different places, including the mainland United States, and the people of the Pacific are exceedingly well behaved, and it's just one of the many things that make living out here such a joy. Okay, now, does panic occasionally occur? Yes, panic does occasionally occur. One famous example, or actually I have two famous examples I can think of, would be Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans. And so what would this be? This would be about like 2005, 2006, when Hurricane Katrina just devastated New Orleans. And yes, people did panic. Well, people panicked because government services broke down. The city was flooded. There weren't enough ambulances. Hospitals had difficulty treating people. Police officers didn't show up to work. And so you had a lot of problems. You had people breaking into stores, stealing beer, stealing televisions, and things like that. You had shootouts between state troopers and federal officers and looters and things like that. And it was really just a very tragic a set of events. But the important thing to keep in mind was really it was a breakdown in communications on the part of the authorities and a breakdown on the part of the authorities in telling people what to do and then providing needed services in the aftermath of the disaster. Another example of this would be, if you remember back in the 90s, a gentleman named Rodney King. He was African American, beat by a couple of police officers in Los Angeles. The police officers were later acquitted, and then we had riots in certain areas of Los Angeles. And so once again, it was a lack of communications. It was a lack of appropriate preparedness on the part of authorities that actually resulted in that panic. But for most instances, when people are communicated with, they're not lied to. They receive the appropriate messages. They're told what to do, and the things they're told to do are within their power. Then panic is very, very, very rare. Okay. So like I said, just keep in mind that people are likeliest to panic, okay, when they feel that they cannot trust who is in authority and who's speaking to them. They're more likely to panic when they feel misled or abandoned in dangerous situations. And when authorities start hedging or hiding bad news in order to prevent a panic, okay, these are situations that are more likely to exacerbate panic on the part of the population, okay. And like I said, experience shows that in true emergencies, true matters of life and death, people do respond exceptionally well. And I can attest to that. Before coming out to the Pacific, I worked in pre-hospital emergency medicine, and I saw it time and time again when there was truly a life and death situation on the line. The general public and even those who are being impacted by the situation tend to rally and come together to overcome the situation rather than panic. And I have every bit as much faith. I've lived in the Pacific, I lived in other islands, and I know that communities come together. Communities don't panic. They take action to protect one another, and that is truly one of the great benefits of the Pacific. So as long as we're communicating appropriately with people, then people will make appropriate choices. And our last one, numero 7, all right, is acknowledging people's fears, okay? When people are afraid, the worst thing you can do is you can patronize them, and you can tell them that they don't need to be afraid, all right? When people have genuine fear, we want to go ahead and acknowledge the fact that people are going to be afraid during disasters, okay? Even when their fear is totally unjustified, people do not respond well to being ignored, okay? They don't respond well to being criticized or mocked or having statistics and comparisons thrown at them. Okay. And especially when that fear has some basis, okay, these approaches get really inappropriate. Okay, so as emergency communicators, what we want to do is we want to acknowledge people's fears even while we give them information they need to put the fear into the context of the situation. Giving people permission to be afraid, but then giving them actions that they can take to allay those fears are what we want to do. Okay? When we do that, we're going to manage the fear. All right, so there's an example of something we could say in our communications. We could say, we know that people are afraid, but we're working as quickly as we can to reach all of the impacted communities. Until rescue teams arrive, we would like community members to do the following. So, in other words, it tells them, look, we acknowledge you're afraid. Okay, we're trying our hardest to get to you, but we acknowledge there are limitations in what we're doing. Until we get there, will you take the following actions? So, in other words, we acknowledge the fear, we give them something to do, we do not lie to them, and so we help manage the fear and we help manage the uncertainty in the local population. Okay, a couple of resources here. The first one I want to mention is down at the bottom of the screen, and that's the Manual of Crisis and Risk Communications from the CDC. All of this information is taken from that. So there's the web link to that. You can go and download it. It's quite a large document, but it has some great information in it, more specifics. Okay. The other thing I want to mention is two other resources that are available through Fiji National University, and that's the Emergency Public Health Discipline located in the School of Public Health and Primary Care. And the Emergency Public Health Discipline actually offers a number of programs, one of which is the Bachelor's of Public Health in Emergency Public Health Management. It's going to be launched either later this year or in 2017. And the good news is that's going to be offered partially online. So if you already have say you already have a bachelor's degree or you already have an associate's degree, it is entirely possible that those credits can be transferred over to Fiji National University. You get credit for that, and then you complete a sequence of 8 courses that will be offered entirely online in emergency public health management, and you get a BPH, EPHM. So very exciting there. If you want some more information on that, you can contact Professor Tammy Mangum. She is the discipline coordinator or the discipline chair for the emergency public health discipline. She also happens to be my wife. Her email there is tamara.mangum@fnu.ac.fj. And then within the emergency public health discipline, we have that postgraduate certificate in disaster risk management that I've mentioned to you already. That's a 4-course sequence. It is at the graduate level, okay, and it is completed entirely online. And one of the big positives for that program is it is taught entirely by my wife and I. It was designed here in the Pacific in concert with SPC and WHO, so it's designed for the needs of the Pacific. And one of the things that my wife and I pride ourselves on in teaching that sequence of courses is that we treat you like a colleague. We don't treat you like a student. We have as much to learn from you as you have from us. So I'm the program coordinator for that, and you can see my email there as well. We're also available for consultations in regards to disaster risk management, disaster communications, and things along those lines as well. So please feel free to get in touch with either one of us if we can be of assistance to you in your emergency communications or other programs. And then, just as we end our presentation here, I do want to mention, as with any of my continuous professional development activities online, please go to my YouTube webpage. If you will watch these little videos like this, and then you will contact me via email, I can send you that lovely certificate of continuing professional development that you see right there on your screen. Suitable for framing, wouldn't you say? All right, designed by myself, comes with my signature and all this wonderful stuff, and you can use that for continuing nursing credits. You can use it for continuing medical education credits. You can use it for advancement with your local human resources department, and so on and so forth. These things are endorsed by the Area Health Education Center out of the College of Micronesia. Under the direction of Dr. Paul Duckenai. So if you would like to receive your certificate of professional development for this or any of the other CPDs that I do, all you have to do is get in touch with me at brian.mangum@fnu.ac.fj. Okay, you made it through another one. I hope you enjoyed it. As always, have a good day. I appreciate the hard work that you're doing out there in the Pacific, and thank you so much for listening.